From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is David Rubenstein, and I have the honor of serving as the co-chair of the 15th National Book Festival with Jim Billington, the Librarian of Congress. And on behalf of the National Book Festival Board, the Library of Congress, I want to welcome everybody to this extraordinary event. So thank you very much for coming. We have everybody here, by definition, is special. I could go through everybody's name, but that will take too long. So please excuse me for not mentioning you, but I'll just do it generically. So we are very pleased that we have a number of members of Congress here. This is the Library of Congress, after all, and the Congress and the Library of Congress have a special relationship. Many members of Congress have shown enormous interest in the Library of Congress. I want to thank those members who are here for doing that and for coming this evening. I also want to thank the supporters of the festival. There are many people who have done a lot to make this possible, financially and otherwise. I'll mention some in a minute, but thank you. I want to thank the Madison Council, which is an arm, in effect, affiliate of the Library of Congress, which helps with support for the Library of Congress. I want to thank them for their support of this event. I want to thank book lovers, and that includes everybody here, people who love books. I also want to thank a special person who's here this evening, the First Lady of Rwanda, Jeannette Kagame. Where is she? Jeannette, thank you. Jeannette is somebody who cares deeply about reading and education for children and is working on putting together the first book festival in Rwanda. So thank you very much for coming this evening. All of us know that we could be doing something else this evening, and all of us know that it's a special weekend. And it's been my view for a long time that people who go to book festivals are likely to live longer and to have a healthier life. Now, that's my observation. I can't prove it. But I do have it on good authority that those who go to book festivals on holiday weekends have a special place in heaven reserved for them. Now, again, I can't prove that. So as you talk today or tomorrow to your friends who are off in the Hamptons or in Martha's Vineyard or Nantucket, you should let them know that there's a special place in heaven reserved for you, and they're not going to have it. It's hard to believe that this book festival is only 15 years old. It seems like a tradition that's gone on for 50 years or longer, but it's only 15 years, honestly. It was in 2001 that the first book festival was held. There were 40 authors, and there were about 30,000 people who attended. It was quite an event, never had been done before. This year, we have 170 authors, and we expect well over 100,000 people on a Labor Day weekend, which is extraordinary. So this is due to the work of a lot of people, and I'll mention some of those in a moment. But at the festival tomorrow, we will have 12 hours of round-the-clock programming. Doors open at 9. From 10 o'clock to 10 o'clock, we're programmed. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of events. And anybody that cares about reading and books and literacy will have a great time there. Now, the Library of Congress itself, for those who may not be that familiar with it, has grown a fair bit as well since its very modest beginning. The Library of Congress was an idea that James Madison had around 1783, but Congress didn't really get around to doing anything about it until 1800. When legislation was passed to move the capital officially to Washington, D.C., as part of that legislation, there was a provision in the legislation to have a Library of Congress, and all of $5,000 was appropriated for it. But the appropriation actually occurred. It wasn't a continuing resolution. And that $5,000 was used to buy 740 books and 3 maps. And that was, for a while, the collection of the Library of Congress. As we all know, in 1812, some people from another part of the Atlantic came to Washington and did some things that they probably now regret. One of those things was burning the Library of Congress. At that time, the Library of Congress really had no books left. And then Thomas Jefferson, who was a great fan of the Library of Congress and a great bibliophile, offered to sell his collection to the Library of Congress. And ultimately, the negotiations went forward and happened. Though, interestingly, there were some people in Congress who debated it because they thought that Thomas Jefferson really didn't believe in God, and if we bought his collection, there would be anti-God books in the collection. So they went through every single title before they agreed to buy the collection. They bought it for about $23,950, and he sold about 6,487 volumes. And that was the Library of Congress collection for a while. Then in 1851, another tragic event happened. There was a fire in the Library of Congress. 55,000 volumes were then in the Library of Congress, and about two-thirds of them were destroyed, and about two-thirds of Thomas Jefferson's collection was destroyed. Now, we're celebrating this year the 200th anniversary of the purchase of Thomas Jefferson's collection, and while all of those books aren't here because of that fire in 1851, through the leadership of Jim Billington and others, we have restored virtually all of those books, not the originals from Thomas Jefferson, but the same volumes, and they are here, and you can see them at any time, and you'll be able to see them this evening if you're interested. So this is the 200th anniversary of that historic collection and purchase from Thomas Jefferson. I want to thank Jim Billington later, and I want to mention him in a few other remarks that I want to make, but Jim Billington is really the father of the National Book Festival, and I will mention him in passing in a moment, but I just want to acknowledge that Jim, I know that this will probably be your last time as the Librarian of Congress presiding over a National Book Festival, and there are other people who are going to talk about you this evening, and I just want to say personally that I've enjoyed working with you extraordinarily. It's been one of the great privileges of my life to get to know you. You've done a great job for the country. I can't imagine we would ever have a better Librarian of Congress. But shortly, somebody with far greater eloquence than I will talk about Jim Billington in ways that I think are worth listening to shortly. So I want to thank the sponsors who made this possible this evening. Let me mention them. Wells Fargo, which has been very, very supportive of the Library of Congress's National Book Festival. AARP, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the Washington Post, the Madison Council, and NEA. And as a result of their gifts in kind and in cash and other things, we are able to have the National Book Festival for free. And I'm committed to making certain that as long as I'm involved, it will always be for free, and I think it's a great thing for the American people that we make it for free. And so everybody who wants to come tomorrow doesn't have to worry about cost, and it's an extraordinary event, and unlike anything really that I've seen anywhere else in the world in terms of a book festival. So I would like to just say that Jim, how did we actually come to this book festival? How did it actually come about? Well, there's many different ways that you can look at it, but victory has 1,000 fathers and defeat is an orphan, it is often said. And this is a victory, but there really are only two people that I deserve the credit for getting this off the ground. At the time of the inaugural festivities of George W. Bush, Laura Bush mentioned to the Librarian of Congress, Jim Billington, that there had been a Texas Book Festival that she had helped to start, and she wanted to know, was there a National Book Festival? And Jim Billington said, well, there isn't yet, but there will be. And Jim Billington then began to work very closely with Laura Bush, and, well, why don't we let her tell you more about it?
Good evening, and welcome to the 15th National Book Festival's Gala. On the eve of our very first National Book Festival, on Friday, September 7th, 2001, we gathered right here in the Coolidge Auditorium of the Library of Congress to begin what we hoped would become a new tradition in our nation's capital. President Bush, many members of his cabinet, and a marvelous group of authors and book lovers just like you were here to help launch what has since become one of the most successful book festivals in the world. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Librarian of Congress, Dr. James Billington, and his excellent staff to bring to Washington a National Book Festival. As a lifelong lover of books and a librarian, I believe that children everywhere should learn to read, and I know that literacy is an essential foundation for democracy. And like Thomas Jefferson, who 200 years ago sent his lifetime collection of books to be housed in the building where you now sit, I too cannot live without books. So it's a special joy to welcome you here tonight to celebrate the 15th anniversary of the National Book Festival. Thank you, Dr. Billington, for your service as our nation's librarian. Thank you to the Library of Congress, the largest, most vibrant library in the world. Thank you to all the friends of the Library of Congress. Happy 200th birthday to our national treasure, the Thomas Jefferson Collection, and happy birthday to yet another American treasure, the National Book Festival.
All right, you're going to now hear from some very distinguished authors, and then I think you'll be quite pleased to hear from their extraordinary comments.
Ladies and gentlemen, Kwame Alexander.
Good evening. I am just honored and very grateful to be here. Thank you to Maria Rana, to Dr. Billington, to the National Book Festival staff for this wonderful event for 15 years of this literary tradition. I grew up as a writer here in this area. I became a poet in earnest across the bridge in Arlington, Virginia. There was a woman, of course. It always starts with a woman that I had a crush on, and I needed to be able to convey that to her. And the only way I knew, I wasn't very cool. I didn't get cool until recently. And so the only way I was able to convey that I was interested in her was through a poem, but not just any poem. I wrote her a poem a day for a year. I am not a painter. Browns and blues, we get along, but we are not close. I am no Van Gogh, but give me plain paper, a dull pencil, some scotch, and I will hijack your curves. Take your soul hostage, paint a portrait so colorful and delicate, you just may have to cut off my ear. And she married me. I am a poet. My life's work is taking the human soul entire, and like Langston Hughes said, squeezing it like a lime or a lemon, drop by drop into atomic words. I am a poet. I write to explore and explode. I write to dream a world that does better, that knows better. My heart is here with you tonight at 7 p.m., but my head is still sometime else at 7 a.m. You see, 24 hours ago, my family and I arrived from Singapore. And to just further illustrate what that means, at 2 a.m. this morning, I hear music and dancing coming from my 7-year-old's room because she thinks it's 2 o'clock p.m. We'd spent 3 weeks in Singapore eating black pepper crab, drinking lime juice, and marveling at the greenest, cleanest city we'd ever seen. But it wasn't just fun, well, at least not for me. It was work. I was there to write, or rather to share my writing with 4,000 students at the Singapore American School. Each day for 3 weeks, I did my normal thing. I talked about growing up in a house with 10,000 books. I talked about wanting to be cool in high school and figuring out that the answer to that was playing tennis. I talked about writing my first poem for my mother on Mother's Day when I was 12. The first line went something like this: "Dear Mommy, I hate Mother's Day." I talked about writing a love poem for a girl I had a crush on in college, and then taking an advanced poetry class with Nikki Giovanni and getting a C- on that poem. I talked about the 20+ rejections I received from the crossover. And then, of course, I shared a poem from the crossover. Josh Bell is my name, but Filthy McNasty is my claim to fame. Folks call me that because my game's acclaimed, so downright dirty it'll put you to. My hair is long, my height's tall. See, I'm the next Kevin Durant, LeBron, and Chris. You guys are a little slow tonight. I'm the one jet lagged. My game is tight, my dad likes to gloat. I ball with Magic and the GOAT. But tricks are for kids, I reply. Don't need your games, my game's so fly. Mom says, your dad's old school, like an old Chevette. You're fresh and new, like a red Corvette. Your game's so sweet, it's crepe Suzette. Each time you play, it's all much better. During the Q&A, after one of the presentations, a boy raised his hand and asked, "Why do you write children's literature?" Because the older we get, the more unwelcoming we are to change. Or maybe we're just too busy for it. Sometimes when the world is not so beautiful, when the women have lost their Sunday song, and when the men are being blown away like sand in a windstorm, I write. I write so that children can imagine and reimagine a world that is a little bit more tolerant and more human. I write to my 7-year-old daughter so that she will have a mirror that shows how beautiful and brilliant she is. I write so our children will have a window to show them what is possible. I am a poet. I say yes to an authentic and meaningful life so that I can have something authentic and meaningful to write about. That is why I write for children. And after I finish this answer, I sort of tear up a little bit. And I'm not sure why, but the students start staring at me sort of awkwardly, and they're in silence, and they don't know whether to comfort me or just sort of wait it out. That evening when I get back to the hotel, a teacher sends me an email with a note from one of the 8th graders who was in the presentation. It read, "Kwame's poetry presentation made me re-examine myself, my doubts, and what limits I place on myself. A common thing I like to do is run away from problems, test, procrastinate. Parents angry at you, just lock the door and turn up the speakers. Bad grades, screw school." But when Kwame said something along the lines of "don't let the nose define you," it sort of slapped me in the face. In a good way. And then the 8th grader ended with this line, these 4 words: "I have to change." That is why I write for children. I am a poet, and poets are dreamers, and I simply want to dream a world that is worthy of them. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Andrea Wulf.
That is so unfair to come after you. Well, it is a great honor to speak about Alexander von Humboldt here in the Jefferson building of the Library of Congress, because there are some wonderful connections between Humboldt, Jefferson, and this library in Washington, D.C. But let me start with a quote about Alexander von Humboldt. This is what Ralph Waldo Emerson said about him in 1869. Humboldt was one of those wonders of the world, like Aristotle, like Julius Caesar, who appear from time to time as if to show us the possibilities of the human mind. Yet, over the past few years, whenever I told someone that I'm writing a book about Alexander von Humboldt, the most common reaction I got was a blank face. Very few people in the English-speaking world have heard about him, yet his name is everywhere. The Humboldt Current, that's the ocean current which hugs the west coast of South America, the Humboldt Penguin, there are mountain ranges across the world which carry his name. In North America alone, there are 4 counties and 13 towns called Humboldt. There are mountains here, there are lakes, there's a river. Even the state of Nevada was almost called Humboldt when a name was discussed in the 1860s. So who was this man? Humboldt was born in 1769 in Prussia, and he became the most celebrated scientist of his age. His contemporaries thought that he was the most famous man after Napoleon, and they called him the Shakespeare of sciences. He was also brazenly adventurous. He went on a 5-year exploration of Latin America, and it was a voyage that shaped his life, his thinking, and that made him legendary across the world. He ventured deep into the mysterious rainforest of Venezuela. He crossed the Andes from Bogota to Lima, climbing the highest volcanoes in the world. And it was during this voyage that he came up with a concept of nature that still very much shapes our thinking today, the idea that nature is a web of life. He described Earth as a living organism where everything is connected. He is also the forgotten father of environmentalism. He warned of the devastating environmental effects of monoculture, irrigation, and deforestation. Amazingly, he predicted in 1800 harmful human-induced climate change. He brought together the arts and the sciences. He said we had to feel nature to understand nature. I could basically go on forever because he was an extraordinary polymath. He was a genius polymath who roamed across the disciplines, and he influenced scientists, writers, poets, and artists. Thomas Jefferson called him one of the greatest ornaments of the age. Napoleon was jealous of him. Charles Darwin said he would have never boarded the Beagle without Humboldt and therefore not conceived of the origin of species. Henry David Thoreau's Walden would have been a very different book without Humboldt. John Muir's ideas on forest preservation were heavily influenced by Humboldt, and even Captain Nemo and Jules Verne's famous 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea owned all of Humboldt's books. But let me tell you a little bit about Humboldt, Jefferson, and Washington, D.C. So after his exploration in Latin America, Humboldt returned to Europe, but he did a little detour, and he stopped at Philadelphia and then in Washington because he wanted to meet the President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, whom he greatly admired. He arrived in D.C. in early June 1804, and he was a very busy man here. Everybody wanted to meet the heroic explorer. James Madison hosted a party for him. Jefferson hosted a party at the White House for him. And he, of course, went to the Library of Congress. He went here on the 4th of June, 1804. He also went to Mount Vernon, spent the afternoon there, and then had dinner in Alexandria. And there's a wonderful description of that evening by the artist Charles Wilson Peale. Basically what happened was they had dinner in Alexandria. It was late. They had come here with, there were 2 carriages. The 2 drivers of the carriages were absolute drunk by the time the dinner was done, and decided to race back to DC. So every time one of the carriage drivers tried to overtake the other one would kind of block them. And there were quite a few hairy moments when the carriages almost overturned. And I'm pretty sure that Humboldt absolutely loved this mad race. But I have to say, I'm rather glad that he didn't die on a road from Alexandria to Washington, D.C. I would not be standing here today. So this was the social side of this visit, but there was also a political side, and the timing of Humboldt's visit to D.C. could have not been better, because Jefferson had just acquired the Louisiana Territory in the previous year. And Jefferson bombarded Humboldt with questions about the new neighbor, Mexico, because Humboldt had just been there. And Humboldt delivered plentiful, including 18 tightly written pages which summarized information about agriculture, mining, and commerce in Mexico. And these are still today in the Library of Congress. This was exactly the kind of intelligence that Jefferson wanted. And over the next few years, Humboldt and Jefferson corresponded, and many of their letters are here at the library. And Humboldt also sent Jefferson his books whenever he published them. So when Jefferson sold his collection of more than 6,000 books exactly 200 years ago to the Library of Congress, there were quite a few Humboldt books in that collection. So my book, The Invention of Nature, is my attempt to find Humboldt and to restore him to his rightful place in the pantheon of nature and science. And the great thing about writing a book about an explorer is that you actually get to travel to pretty amazing places yourself, obviously all in the course of research. So for me, this has been an incredible journey through landscapes and letters. I went to the Andes, for example, and went up the Antisana, which is a volcano, and at 13,000 feet I found the hut in which Humboldt had spent a night in 1802. I climbed the Chimborazo, another volcano in Ecuador, which had been incredibly elemental for Humboldt's vision of nature. I paddled along the Orinoco and listened to the strange bellowing cries of howler monkeys in the rainforest in Venezuela. I walked around Walden Pond in freshly fallen snow, and I went to the Yosemite, where John Muir had implemented Humboldt's ideas of forest preservation. Appropriately, when researching an explorer, I also experienced a hurricane, though admittedly not in Latin America, but in New York, when I got stuck there for 5 days during Hurricane Sandy in October 2012. So now I'm here, finally launching my book after many years of research in the city where Humboldt and Jefferson first met. And I hope I made you a little bit curious about this man, because he was really extraordinary, and I think he deserves to be known much better. He was, after all, as one contemporary said, the greatest man since the deluge. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rit Atkinson.
Well, that's so unfair to follow both of you. But good evening. Welcome. I've lived in Washington for almost 40 years, and this is a town that, despite its dysfunction and its deep weirdness, appreciates books, those who write them, those who edit and publish them, those who sell them. I write about war, both the inhuman side and the human side, which is one of the themes of this year's book festival. If you're from out of town and you're looking for a touristy thing to do this weekend after the festival, I suggest you cross the Potomac River and visit Section 60 of Arlington National Cemetery. Section 60 is where many of our battle dead from Afghanistan and Iraq are buried, almost 1,000 of them. I once called it the saddest acre in America, but it's actually almost 14 acres, sadly. First Lady Laura Bush gave us the National Book Festival. Others gave us Section 60. As an Army brat, I grew up on Army posts, and most of them have a national cemetery full of war dead For a kid, there was something mesmerizing about these places, including the regularity of the gravestones, each 28 inches high, bone white, perfectly aligned, each grave containing a world gone. W.H. Auden said, "We were put on this earth to make things." I think he would take a broad view of what we should be making, a poem, a novel, a cookbook, a gadget, but the point is to be a maker. Like some of you, I suspect it took me a while to figure out what it was that I was supposed to make. I did the usual stumbling, fumbling, adolescent thing, post-adolescent, post-adolescent. I thought I wanted to be an Army officer like my father. I had an appointment to West Point, David Petraeus' class, in fact, but decided at the very last minute not to go because I wanted to study literature and maybe even try my hand at writing. I also wanted to go to a place where there were girls, and at that time, West Point admitted exactly 0. I stumbled into the newspaper business, eventually stumbled into the Washington Post, because as an Army brat, I knew the difference between an F-16 fighter and an M16 rifle. I was given military topics to write about. I found that my calling was to make something of all those graves, those worlds destroyed, those young men dying young. So what I do is write about war, and that sadly never goes out of fashion. It's always a growth industry. I now consider myself a recovering journalist. Instead of writing the first rough draft of history, trying to use a longer lens, writing narrative military history. Every scribbler since Thucydides knows that writing about war means writing about love, valor, venality, the foolishness of fools, the knavery of knaves, the whole panoply of human behavior and misbehavior. In early 2003, between books, I did some backsliding into journalism and went off to war from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, to Iraq with the 101st Airborne Division, then commanded by my non-West Point classmate, Dave Petraeus. One day, just after the invasion began, Petraeus and I were standing outside in a screaming sandstorm in a remote hellhole of southern Iraq, our faces no more than 8 inches apart. Things were not going very well in the war, not very well at all, and he said, "Tell me how this ends. Tell me how this ends." I recently finished writing 750,000 words about the American role in the liberation of Europe in World War II. We just commemorated on Wednesday the 70th anniversary of the formal end of the war. Oddly enough, during the home stretch, that question perplexed me. Tell me how this ends. Authors know that finding an ending can be as difficult as finding a beginning sometimes. We all know how World War II ends, right? Ticker tape, America ascendant, boom in post-war babies, some of whom are sitting in this room tonight. But then I came across a document compiled by the U.S. Army in 1946 that suggested how to put a period on those 750,000 words. The document recounted in exquisite detail how in a large warehouse at 601 Hardesty Avenue in Kansas City, the U.S. Army Effects Bureau had begun as a modest quartermaster operation with a half-dozen employees in February 1942. That expanded to more than 1,000 workers, and by August 1945, they were handling 60,000 shipments a month, each laden with the effects of American dead from 6 continents. Hour after hour, day after day, shipping containers were unloaded onto receiving dock and then hoisted by elevator to the depot's 10th floor. Here, the containers traveled by assembly line conveyor belt down to the 7th floor as inspectors pawed through each container to extract pornography, ammunition, perhaps amorous letters from a girlfriend you didn't want a grieving widow to see. Workers used grinding stones and dentist drills to remove bloodstains and corrosion from helmets and web gear. A detailed inventory was then pinned to each repacked container before it was stacked in a storage bin. And all the while, in a huge adjacent room, banks of typists were banging out letters, up to 70,000 letters a month by the summer of 1945. And the gist of those letters was this: "Dear Sir, dear Madam, we have your dead son's stuff. You want it back? Where should we send it?" Over the years, Effects Bureau inspectors found amazing things: tapestries, enemy swords, a German machine gun, walrus tusks, a shrunken head, a tobacco sack full of diamonds. Among thousands of diaries also collected in Kansas City was a black notebook that belonged to Lieutenant Herschel G. Horton, 29 years old, from Aurora, Illinois, shot in the leg and hip during a firefight with the Japanese on New Guinea. He had dragged himself into a grass shanty, and in the several days that it took for him to die, he wrote a final letter home to his family. And it began, "My dear sweet father, mother, and sister, I lay here in this terrible place, wondering not why God has forsaken me, but why he is making me suffer." That's how it ends. That's how it always ends. And I'll end this evening, since we are in the Library of Congress, by quoting our recent poet laureate, Natasha Trethewey, who ends her poem, Pilgrimage, which is about a visit to Vicksburg, with these lines: "In my dream, the ghost of history lies down beside me, rolls over, pins me beneath a heavy arm. My job is to make the reader feel that heavy arm." Thanks very much for the privilege of being with you this evening. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Louise Erdrich.
I feel like I've been everywhere already. From a world being dreamed by someone with a child who wants to make it worthy for, to a universe where Humboldt's, in Saul Bellows' words, Humboldt's dream of nature is realized. And to your world, I want to thank you, all of you, for bringing me there. The first thing I'm going to do after this is read your latest books. Thank you. Buju nindinawe maganidok, nijanishnabedok. Miigwich biajaye komanungomo nagashing. I wanted to say something in Ojibwe because we're in the Jefferson building. I thought it would be exciting. The reason I know a little Ojibwe is because my mother is Turtle Mountain Chippewa, and my father met her when he went there to teach. And the story is he looked across the road and he saw her walking across and he couldn't stop looking, and his brother was with him and he said, "I'm going to marry her." And they did. And so I'm here tonight. Thank you. That's what you do as a writer. You get lost in your own stories, I guess. When I was informed of this award, I was astounded, and I looked back, as anyone would, through literary history, heroes, people, and I noticed, as a woman and as a mother, and as a Native woman, my father's German, my mother's Native, that there were very few women fewer mothers, and very, very few Native women. So I also want to thank reliable birth control, family planning, and I think that there is no question that there is a coincidence between the remarkable and amazing novels and nonfiction, everything that's being written in the past 40 years, and the very simple fact of birth control. So I want to say that, because as a mother, thank you. Yeah, I know I wouldn't have had the presence of mind without knowing something about my future. I would also like to dedicate these short remarks to my friend Loretta Monette's literature class at the Turtle Mountain High School in Belcourt, North Dakota, on the Turtle Mountain Reservation. And I'm just going to say this because I'm hoping this is streamed, and I know they want to watch it. So I'm addressing all of us, although I'm going to say young people. We're all young, so young people. You can reach into another person's most hidden self, the existence you can't know otherwise, by reading books. By reading, you will reach into yourself and find out who you are. Dear young people, reading is about connecting hearts. So I said I grew up in a small town, and I was the oldest of 7 in North Dakota. I was the oldest of 7 children. And our parents were and are, my father's 90, my mother's 80, they were and are school teachers, because as a teacher, you never lose your teaching instinct. Everything, when I grew up, was labeled with, every object had a German or Spanish or French label on it so that we would learn these languages. And on the rare occasions that we were permitted to watch television, we had to cover our eyes during commercials. My father especially was very worried that he loved capitalism in many ways, but he really didn't like this, how we would be persuaded to buy useless objects if we watched these commercials. And to this day, he's still that way. He has never bought a pair of socks, and that's going way too far. He mends his own socks. He's 90. Those were the days, though, that a parent would say, put down that book and do something useful. I got that a lot. And now we get this misty feeling when we see a child somewhere reading a book, right? We don't want to disturb that intimacy. And as the daughter of school teachers, I'm very aware that really the future of what we hold so dear, of literature and books, really is in the hands of school teachers. Teaching a young person to love reading is really a mind-bending task, and they do it every day, and they do it with love. And I see every day, along with my daughter Pallas, who's here with me, that children do love books. It's like a natural sort of, once they really are committed to reading, they fall in love. We own a bookstore. It's called Birch Bark Books. It's a little place in Minneapolis. And we're going to stock your books. We're going to sell your books. We love bringing books to people. And we still see children walking into the bookstore with big handfuls of change. I mean, maybe they held somebody up, but they've got this money that they've collected from babysitting or under the couch cushions, and they're still buying a book that they've had to scrape some money together to buy, and they want it to be theirs. But when I grew up, we were living in a small town. School teachers didn't have much money, and we had 3 books. We had Marjorie Morningstar by the first the first author who was awarded this prize, Herman Wouk. Marjorie Morningstar was on the highest shelf, so I couldn't read it until I learned how to climb up the side of some very rickety shelves. I read it when I was about 8. It was amazing. And we had the Bible, and we had Animal Farm by George Orwell. And I read that when I was 9, and I thought, the best pig story ever. And when I was 13, I read it again, and I thought, it changed everything for me because I couldn't believe that something could be written on 2 levels. My escape, or my treasure, the place that I was educated was a library. It was a town library endowed by some very good people in the town. I read most of the books in there, or tried to read most of the books of there before I left Wahpeton. And, my mother, I hope this isn't streamed now because I'm going to say this. My mother took out a book called Portnoy's Complaint because I told her it was great. And she brought it home, and she read it. This is a small town, and you had to sign your name on library cards, right? And she erased your name and put it back in the middle of the night. So this prize is especially meaningful to me. It's meaningful that as a culture, we consider books so important that we have established and maintained a national library. To me, this says more about us as a nation than our military power, than our global influence, than our wealth. This is our wealth. And what this wealth involves is our freedom to think what we think, say what we say, and publish what we write for other people. And then for these works to be treated as treasure, this is what is noble about our country. My first job in Wahpeton was hoeing sugar beets. And I've said that writing was similar, that I spend my days chopping words out that suck the life from sentences. It's in a way, writing is a very minuscule, tedious, almost insect-like operation, But I still feel very much like the 13-year-old girl that I was when I had my first job. And I still feel so excited and so happy that I don't have to have that job. I don't have to hoe sugar beets. It's changed everything, too, because once you know what it's like to work on that level, it changes how you see the entire structure of the world and where this country came from, the foundation upon which its beauty and wealth and honor and gorgeous buildings exists. It exists on the sweat and the hard work, the pain of people who are in slavery, the dispossession of Native people, backs of women. All of that is part of what we all write about. And all of that is part of the extraordinary complexity that we find ourselves in. I was so nervous about coming here because I realize again whenever I'm going somewhere that I have always forgotten to invent a literary persona. Now it's completely too late. I'm writing a book now that started with a Indian boarding school experience. My grandfather, Patrick Gorno, who testified in Congress on behalf of the Turtle Mountain Chippewa, was educated not quite to the 8th grade level in Indian boarding schools. And I researched his life. I was able to get all his school files through the Library of Congress Midwestern Archives in Kansas City to deal straight on with a wonderful librarian and to have his very files and his letters in his own handwriting sent to me. And he has been a hero, a family hero of ours. Very learned, very interesting, wonderful, wonderful traditional dancer, just terrific man. I didn't know that he'd run away from school. And I didn't know that he'd tried so hard to get back into the boarding school that he was sent away from, and that the superintendent had written him back a letter. Dear Pat, we can't let you in. It wouldn't be right. After the intoxicating substance that you manufactured behind the barn with the other 6th graders, we just don't know if we can let you back in. The libraries are full of things we don't know. And it's a discovery, and it's a marvelous thing that you do as librarians, and that we all can participate in by supporting you. In that book, as many Native people do, in fact, more Native people per percentage of population enlist in the armed services than any other population group. In that book, a young man in 2003 has joined the National Guard, in which my father served for 36 years. He has joined the National Guard, extremely excited, full, as many people are and were in the rural parts of this country, full of fervor, full of excitement to change the world, to make the world better. But it's 2003, and to his disappointment, he finds that this action, this war that is going on in Iraq, will be over in 100 days. If I aspire to anything, it is to understand acts of love, self-sacrifice, trust, bravery, shame of cowardice, the learning opportunities of failure, joy, absurdity, everything about ourselves in our singular human existence. So this is who I am, and this is all I am, a writer trying over and over with insane persistence to understand. Thank you.
How many people here are attending their first book festival, National Book Festival? Can you raise your hands? Wow. How many have attended the last 5? The last 10? All 15? Wow. Okay. Jim, we know you attended all 15. There are a number of authors who were at the first book festival, and I just want to acknowledge a number of them here. Scott Berg, are you here? Scott? Scott, stand up. Scott, stand up. Scott is the author of great books on Woodrow Wilson, Lindbergh, among other things, Katharine Hepburn, and winner of the Pulitzer Prize. Thank you for coming again, Scott. Tom Mallon, a great historical novelist. Where's Tom? Is he here somewhere? There he is in the back. Thank you. He was at the first book festival as well. Walter Mosley, a mystery and crime fiction writer, a great one. Where is he? There he is. Thank you. And is Tom Brokaw here? Tom is going to be here tomorrow. Is Tom here now? All right. He's going to be here tomorrow, and we're going to have a great session with him. And there's one other person I want to acknowledge who was at the first book festival. He's a person who I think has done more to get Americans excited about history and their history than any other living writer. He's a man who's written 10 books. 2 of them have won Pulitzer Prizes. His books have sold more than 10 million copies, translated into 17 different languages. He is the recipient of more than 50 honorary degrees. He has won the Medal of Freedom, and he is the proud father of 5 children and 19 grandchildren, and is a man that I think has done more to help the Library of Congress practically than any other living author by speaking about the Library of Congress so eloquently and so frequently, and he did much of his research on his books at the Library of Congress. It's my honor to introduce David McCullough.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I was speaking at a college in California not long ago, and in the question and answer period, I was asked, aside from Harry Truman and John Adams, how many other presidents have you interviewed? Well, appearances notwithstanding, I never knew either Mr. Truman or Mr. Adams. But I've often been asked if I could be somewhere to witness some event that took place in the lives of either of those men. Because of my devotion to this great institution here, I would love to have asked John Adams how he felt signing the first Library of Congress into law as President of the United States in 1800 on April 24th, a day that I think all of us ought to know, a date all of us ought to know. It was probably one of the very few things that he and his Vice President, Thomas Jefferson, agreed on. And of course, they both expressed their love of books in a vivid fashion more than once. Adams grew up in a house where there were no books, maybe a Bible. His mother was illiterate. And as he said, he went to Harvard, discovered books, and I've read forever. When he was in his 80s, he embarked on a 16-volume history of France in French, which he'd taught himself. We've come a long way, and for a very good reason, by so many people who went before us who did so much that we should never, ever take for granted. And the establishment of an institution such as this here on the Acropolis of our country, where it belongs, was one of the greatest of all American achievements, and still is. Think of it, the greatest library in the world. And it began here. And we are the beneficiaries, all of us. I speak tonight at this celebrant occasion, this wonderful book festival, as one whose life was changed by this library, whose whole direction, as in my ambitions of what I would make of my life, changed. 50 years ago, this year, I signed my first book contract, and I couldn't believe that a publisher was willing to sign a book contract with me, because I'd come upon, quite by accident, a discovery here, right upstairs, about the disastrous flood in Johnstown, Pennsylvania of 1889. I'd grown up in Pittsburgh, which is not very far away. I'd heard about this calamity all my life, but I really didn't know what happened. And I saw a collection of photographs lying on a big table upstairs and stopped to look at them and could not believe the scale of devastation revealed in those photographs. So I took a book out of the library to read about it, and it wasn't very good. So I took another book out of the library, and it was, if anything, less satisfactory. It was a potboiler written at the time. While in college as an English major, I'd come under the influence of the wonderful Thornton Wilder, who was a fellow in Davenport College at Yale, and I was a resident in Davenport College. And you could go in and sit down beside him at lunch in the dining hall, if he happened to be there, and talk with Thornton Wilder. And somebody once asked him, how did you get the ideas for your plays and your novels? And he said, well, I would imagine a story that I would like to read, or a story I'd love to see performed on the stage. And I'd check around and find out, and if nobody had written it, I would write it myself so I could see it performed on stage or read it in a book. And I said to myself, why don't you try and write the book about the Johnstown flood that you wished you could read? I'd never done any research of a serious nature in my life. I'd had relatively little history. I knew I wanted to be a writer. I was here working for the U.S. Information Agency, which I had done because when Kennedy gave his call for all of us to serve our country, to do something for your country, I thought, I'm going to do that. So I quit my job in New York at time in life. I was still in my 20s, came to Washington, knew nobody in the Kennedy crowd, knew nobody here in the government, wound up, stroke of luck, working for the U.S. Information Agency, which was what brought me up to the Library of Congress to check something out for a project I was involved with. That was more than 50 years ago. I've just published my 10th book, most of which is based on, and the whole idea of the book is based on what kind of human beings were the Wright brothers. And I was able to find that right here, upstairs, across the way in the new library, in the Wright brothers collection, which is one of the greatest collections of letters in all of the great collections of the Library of Congress. Over 1,000 private letters, private correspondence, just between the father, the two brothers, and the daughter. More than 1,000 letters written mainly by Wilbur Wright concerning their professional efforts to discover the secret to flight. You can go inside their lives, inside their worries, inside their determination to not be stopped by failure, inside the fact that they had the capacity to learn from failure. And they were knocked down and seemingly defeated many, many times in many ways, but they would not give up, and they always came back. What did we learn from that defeat, that failure? And to have the privilege of reading those letters and discovering that these two men who broke one of the most highly technical, difficult problems of all time and changed the world, changed history with what they accomplished, who had no money, who had no education beyond high school, but who grew up in a house full of books, who grew up under the inspiration and direction of a father who had them read everything, but mainly the great works of literature: Virgil, Voltaire, Mark Twain, Hawthorne, poetry, drama, theater, Shakespeare, natural history, everything, and to read above the level always from the childhood on, who had what would amount to a brilliant and very full, good liberal arts education in a tiny little wood frame house on a side street in Dayton, Ohio. And yet they mastered this most difficult of all technical problems, not because they've been trained in technology or science, but because they had that reach of mind and that sense of having purpose in life, high purpose. And by being curious about everything. Orville Wright was once asked if he didn't agree with those who said that he and his brother were the perfect example of how far an American could go with having had no advantages growing up. He said, "Oh, that's not true. We had the greatest advantage any child could have. We grew up in a house that stimulated and encouraged intellectual curiosity." I've had the privilege of using the treasures having my mind opened, my curiosity enhanced by this library for every subject I have undertaken. Every one. I owe my life's work to this library. And my gratitude and my appreciation can never be sufficiently fulfilled in what I hope I can do for this library as time goes on and have in years past. And one of the greatest privileges, the greatest friendships that I've made in my life is with Jim Billington. And I want to tell you, that that man, that scholar, that thinker, that Oxford graduate, that professor of history at Harvard and Princeton, that man has changed this library in ways that no one could have imagined when he first became the Librarian of Congress now 28 years ago. On the day that he was sworn in as the new Librarian of Congress, he said some things that I've recently read that I think are the prediction that was fulfilled. He said during this press conference, he maintained that celebrating the life of the mind is something that a free people needs to do. The life of the mind. He also said, in taking his oath of office, as it were, that the library should move out more broadly and more deeply. Jim Billington has made this library an international institution. He has made it a resource for the world to tap into. And he's delved deeper into innumerable subjects. He's also an idea factory. I've never known anybody like you, Jim. He's got ideas coming out every day. So hard to keep up just following the ideas. And he has enthusiasm for learning, enthusiasm for curiosity. And he has this wonderful optimism about what can be accomplished. Serving one's country, we think of the military, of course, and we think of some of our more admirable representatives in our government. But we also ought to think of those people who are doing the kind of work that the people who work here do in this great institution, and about their respect for leadership. I had a wonderful conversation just today with a very important former member of the staff with whom I have worked over 25 years or more, now retired. We were talking about Mr. Billington, Dr. Billington. He said it takes a big individual with big ideas to lead a big and important institution as he has, and as such institutions ought to be led. The gift of leadership is part of James Billington's many abilities to which he has devoted so much of his life, and to the benefit, to the great advance of this institution, and consequently to our country. He speaks 8 languages. 8 languages. I can barely get by in one. He has innumerable honorary degrees. He is an important historian. He taught himself Russian on his own by going to the public library and using a dictionary when he was still in high school because he wanted to read about Russian history and Russian life. He is phenomenal. I think, it's my opinion, he could be classified as perfect if he only had a sense of humor. So, Jim, I express the gratitude that so many of us feel in our hearts as well as our minds for how you have served our country and enlarged the reach and the scope and the appeal of this great American institution, the Library of Congress.
Thank you all very much. Thank you all for being here. And I know that the applause which you generously gave after that beautiful tribute by David McCullough, and after the wonderful readings of these authors tonight, so moving, so powerful, and by your all being here, that I can only thank you and say that the applause is for you. And the applause is also for the Congress, which has been the greatest institutional patron on a bipartisan basis through thick and thin, really in the history of the world, the biggest patron. But also the extraordinary patronage of those who have supported this book festival, of the many authors. We'll have the biggest group ever coming this year, of the many readers, of the multi-generational power of reading, and also of our host tonight, who spoke so eloquently about this history and who has made the Library of Congress Book Festival something that will endure by his generous backing over a multi-year period as the really principal donor and an extraordinary benefactor, and himself a live participant and great enthusiasm for reading, literacy, and so forth. It's a privilege to be in the presence of these two people. David McCullough, who started it out, was our first book festival, talked to me 3 days before 9/11 occurred, and said, "This is a great idea. I want to help it." Well, help it he did. And its future is as bright as its past. And the big thing is not so much what any one individual has done, but we have an extraordinary staff. So thanks to them, thanks to the Congress who's made this possible, thanks to the donors who've taken special interest in this, thanks to these two people who were kind of the bookends. David McCullough, which more than anybody else started us all up, started us on this adventure. And David Rubenstein, who's made it permanent, and all of you who have participated in it. So the applause is all for you. Endless thanks, and God bless you all, and have a wonderful time at what will be our largest group of authors and all the other people in this great world of translating the human story through the beauty of language and the compactness and the admiration of a book. I remember George Kennan once said, late in life, close to his 100th birthday, he looked out the window of my office here and said, "I wonder if everyone will ever always be able to enjoy being alone with a good book on a rainy day." It's the beginning of conversation, of dialogue. And this is a place where it happens. It began, for many of the founding fathers, it began reading by natural light before they went to work in the society, and then began talking about the different experiences they'd had, the different books that they'd read, reading was so fundamental. It always is. Thank you all for supporting it. Thank you all for being here. And thank you most particularly to our host and our speaker, the person who really began it all, sustained it all, and the person who's made sure that this thing will last by his own wonderful enthusiasm for books, reading, literacy, the whole bang. And thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Jim. This is a composite of the posters for the 15 book festivals, and on behalf of the National Book Festival Library of Congress, we want to present this to Jim. Jim? So, just want to say thank you to everybody who's come this evening. We are going to have dinner upstairs. The main reading room is open. And tomorrow we have a book festival. And as we all know, Thomas Jefferson, one of the great patrons of the Library of Congress, said that part of life is about pursuing happiness. And tomorrow, all of us get a chance to pursue happiness. So pursue some happiness this evening. Tomorrow, Jim Billington, thank you for everything you've done. And David, thank you for a great speech.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.